May 8, 1945, Bavaria, Germany. When the Allied troops advanced through the German countryside, they left behind not only weapons and ruins, but also invisible people, prisoners, women, children. Among them was Akiko Tanaka, who at 23 years old had learned that surviving meant obeying and staying silent. But when American tanks appeared on the horizon, a new dilemma began. Would this be liberation or just another kind of captivity? Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we reopen forgotten stories. The morning mist clung to the Bavarian hills like smoke from distant battles, thick and grey in the pre-dawn hours that had become Akiko's favorite time of day. It was the only moment when the converted monastery fell completely silent, when the fears and whispered conversations of 43 other Japanese women couldn't penetrate her thoughts. She pressed her face against the cold glass of the narrow window, her breath fogging the surface as she watched the valley below slowly emerge from darkness. For 18 months, this view had been her world. Rolling hills scarred by tank treads, blackened patches where bombs had fallen, and the winding road that led to the village of Oberammergau, where German civilians went about their daily lives as if the women imprisoned in the old monastery didn't exist. The building itself was a contradiction, built for prayer and contemplation, now housing the forgotten casualties of a war that had spun far beyond anyone's control. The sound of engines broke through the morning stillness, not the harsh growl of German Wehrmacht vehicles she had grown accustomed to, but something different, deeper, more powerful. Akiko wiped the condensation from the window and saw them. A convoy of olive-green vehicles rolling up the winding mountain road, their white stars clearly visible even in the dim light. "American tanks," she whispered in Japanese, the words feeling strange on her tongue. Behind her she heard Mariko stirring in the narrow bunk they shared, the former Red Cross nurse who had been captured near Stalingrad and who still sometimes called out Russian phrases in her sleep. "What did you say?" Mariko's voice was thick with the exhaustion that never seemed to leave any of them, no matter how many hours they slept. "Americans. They're coming up the road." Within minutes, the entire dormitory was awake. Women gathered at the few available windows, their faces pressed against the glass like children watching a parade. Some were crying, tears of relief, fear, or simple, overwhelming emotion after so many months of uncertainty. Others stood silently, their expressions unreadable after learning to hide their feelings behind masks of compliance. The vehicle stopped at the monastery's iron gates, and Akiko could see soldiers dismounting with the efficiency that spoke of countless similar operations. But there was something different about their movements, less aggressive, more measured. No weapons drawn, no shouted commands in harsh German that had become the soundtrack of their captivity. The sound of boots on cobblestones echoed through the courtyard, but not the sharp clicking of German jackboots they had grown to dread. These were softer, the rhythm different, American combat boots walking at a normal pace rather than the military march that had announced every inspection, every count, every moment of fear over the past year and a half. Heavy wooden doors that hadn't been opened except for their captors swung wide, letting in sunlight that seemed impossibly bright after months of dim monastery corridors. Sergeant Michael O'Brien stepped through the doorway, his helmet tucked under one arm and his expression carefully neutral. He was younger than Akiko had expected, maybe 25, with the kind of open face that suggested he came from a place where people smiled without calculation. Behind him stood another soldier, and the sight of him made several women gasp audibly. Japanese features, American uniform, the impossible contradiction of their own people wearing the enemy's colors. Staff Sergeant Ken Nakamura looked as uncomfortable as they felt, his eyes scanning their faces with a mixture of recognition and pain. "Ladies," Nakamura spoke in careful, formal Japanese that carried traces of an American accent, "the war has ended. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. You are now under the protection of the United States Army." Protection. The word hung in the air like incense, foreign and almost incomprehensible after so many months of existing at the mercy of people who saw them as problems to be managed rather than human beings to be cared for. Akiko exchanged glances with Mariko, both women searching each other's faces for some indication of how to process this information. Through the tall monastery windows, they could see more American soldiers setting up tents in what had been the monastery's vegetable garden. Their movements were efficient but unhurried, businesslike but not harsh. No one was shouting. No one was barking orders. Some soldiers were even laughing at something one of their comrades had said, the sound of genuine amusement carrying across the courtyard like a song from another world. Sergeant O'Brien stepped forward, and Nakamura translated his words. The sergeant wants you to know that medical personnel will be examining each of you today, not as prisoners, but to ensure you receive any care you might need. You will be provided with clean clothing, hot meals and proper bedding. Tomorrow we will begin discussing arrangements for your repatriation to Japan. Repatriation. Home. The words felt too large to hold in her mind. Akiko found herself thinking of her parents' house in Kyoto, with its small garden where her mother grew chrysanthemums and her father practiced calligraphy in the early morning hours. Did it still exist? Were her parents still alive? The war had cut off all communication 18 months ago, leaving her in a void of uncertainty that had become its own form of torture. That first day under American custody passed like a dream. Hot soup arrived in metal bowls instead of the thin gruel they had subsisted on. Clean blankets were distributed, and for the first time since their capture, each woman was given her own sleeping space. A young medic with kind eyes and gentle hands examined them not for signs of disease or weakness, but with genuine concern for their well-being. "When did you last have a full meal?" he asked through Nakamura's translation, his voice carrying the sort of professional concern Akiko remembered from doctors back home. "Are you experiencing any pain or discomfort? Is there anything specific you need for your health?" Questions about their welfare, asked as if their answers mattered, as if they were people deserving of care rather than inconvenient remnants of a war machine that had finally ground to a halt. As evening fell, American generators hummed to life outside, providing electric lighting they hadn't seen in months. The monastery corridors, which had been pools of shadow and whispered fear, now glowed with warm yellow light that made everything seem safer, more hopeful. But it was the music that truly marked the change. A distant radio somewhere in the American camp was playing swing music, brass instruments and saxophone melodies that drifted through the stone walls like smoke from a different world. The rhythm was foreign, the instruments unfamiliar, but there was something in the music that spoke of joy, of celebration, of people who still believed in happiness. Akiko lay in her own bed for the first time in 18 months, a clean pillow beneath her head and a warm blanket pulled up to her chin. Around her, the other women were settling into sleep, their breathing gradually evening out into the rhythm of people who finally felt safe enough to truly rest. Tomorrow, the Americans had said, there would be decisions to make about the future, about repatriation, about returning to lives they had barely dared to dream might still be possible. But tonight, as the swing music played softly in the distance and American guards walked their posts with the quiet efficiency of people protecting rather than confining, Akiko closed her eyes and fell asleep, without wondering if she would see another dawn. For the first time since her capture, she dreamed of home. 3 weeks had passed since liberation, and the transformation of their daily existence felt like waking from a nightmare into a world where impossibly good things could actually happen. The monastery that had been their prison had been converted into something resembling a rehabilitation center, complete with a makeshift library where American soldiers had donated books, a common area with comfortable chairs, and windows that were open during the day to let in fresh mountain air. Akiko had begun to measure time differently. Instead of counting days until some unknown end, she found herself noticing small pleasures, the way sunlight streamed through stained glass windows during morning prayers, the taste of real coffee that American cooks prepared each morning, the sound of laughter from the courtyard, where some of the younger women had begun teaching American soldiers basic Japanese phrases in exchange for English lessons. The Americans had provided them with clothing that fit properly, simple dresses and sweaters in muted colors that made them feel almost normal again. They had been given toiletries, writing materials, and most importantly, the promise that letters to their families in Japan would be delivered as soon as mail service could be established. The future, which had been an impossibility for so long, was slowly becoming something they could envision again. Captain James Rodriguez had become a familiar presence, making daily rounds to check on their welfare and address any concerns. He was a man in his early 30s with graying hair at his temples and the kind of patient demeanor that suggested he had children of his own back home. When he spoke to them through Staff Sergeant Nakamura's translation, his eyes met theirs directly, seeking understanding rather than compliance. On this particular morning, Captain Rodriguez called a meeting in what had once been the monastery's chapel. The room still held traces of its sacred purpose: carved wooden pews, a stone altar, and magnificent stained glass windows that cast jeweled patterns of light across the assembled women. 43 Japanese women sat quietly, their faces showing the mixture of hope and caution that had become their default expression when dealing with authority figures. "Ladies," Captain Rodriguez began, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone delivering news he hoped would be received well, "I want to update you on the progress of repatriation arrangements. We've received word from Pacific Command that transport ships to Japan are being organized, but due to the volume of displaced persons requiring repatriation, your departure will be delayed approximately 6 weeks." Staff Sergeant Nakamura translated carefully, watching their faces for reactions. 6 more weeks. For some, this felt like an eternity. For others who had begun to find comfort in their current situation, it felt like borrowed time to prepare for an uncertain homecoming. "However," Rodriguez continued, "we want to ensure that your transition back to civilian life is as comfortable and beneficial as possible. You've been through experiences that most people cannot imagine, and we believe that gradual exposure to normal peacetime activities might help with your adjustment." He paused, glancing at Nakamura, who nodded encouragingly. "Tomorrow evening, the town of Garmisch-Partenkirchen will be hosting their annual Spring Fair. It's a traditional celebration that was suspended during the war years, but the townspeople have decided to revive it as a symbol of returning to normal life. There will be music, dancing, food vendors, games, and local families attending with their children." The chapel fell completely silent, except for the whisper of wind through a broken section of roof tiles and the distant sound of American soldiers conducting their morning exercises in the courtyard. Akiko felt Mariko's hand find hers, her friend's grip tense with disbelief. "We would like to extend an invitation," Rodriguez continued, "to any of you who might be interested in attending this fair. You would be accompanied by escort officers, of course, but you would be free to participate in the festivities as guests, rather than as supervised detainees." The translator's voice carried a note of wonder as he rendered the captain's words into Japanese. A fair, music and dancing, the opportunity to walk among civilian families and participate in celebration rather than simply endure confinement. After everything they had survived, such possibilities seemed to belong to a different universe entirely. Yuki Sato, who at 38 had naturally assumed the role of their informal leader, was the first to speak. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had worked as a government translator before the war and understood the complexities of international relations. "Captain Rodriguez," she said carefully, "with all respect, we are grateful for your kindness, but we must ask, why would Americans extend such generosity to enemy nationals? What is the purpose of this invitation?" Nakamura translated the question, and Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving across their faces as if he were trying to see them as individuals rather than as a group. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of sincerity that was unmistakable. "Ma'am, you ask a fair question, and you deserve an honest answer. The war is over, Japan has surrendered, Germany has surrendered, and the fighting has stopped. But ending a war is more than just silencing the guns. It's about remembering how to be human beings again, how to see former enemies as people deserving of dignity and respect." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "You were never our enemies in any meaningful sense. You were civilians, medical personnel and support staff caught in circumstances beyond your control. Our job now is not to punish you for a war you didn't start, but to help you return to your lives with your dignity intact and your faith in human decency restored." The translation hung in the air, and Akiko found herself studying the American captain's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda. But his expression remained steady, open, almost vulnerable in its honesty. "Furthermore," Rodriguez added, "my soldiers have been at war for years. They've seen too much death, too much destruction. They need to remember what they were fighting to preserve, the possibility of normal life, of families celebrating together, of music and laughter and simple human joy. In a sense, this invitation benefits all of us." That evening, the women gathered in their dormitory for the kind of intense discussion that had become ritual whenever they faced decisions about their future. The room buzzed with whispered conversations in various dialects of Japanese, reflecting the different regions they had come from before the war scattered them across the world. Some feared a trap. "What if this is some kind of test?" worried Hanako, a young woman who had been captured while serving as a radio operator. "What if they're observing how we behave in public to determine our suitability for repatriation?" Others couldn't believe such generosity existed in the world they had known. "Americans don't do things without reasons," insisted Keiko, whose husband had been killed in the Pacific Theater. "There must be some agenda we don't understand." But Sachiko, a former teacher whose natural optimism had somehow survived 18 months of captivity, offered a different perspective. "What if they're simply telling the truth? What if some people in this world still believe in kindness for its own sake?" Akiko found herself thinking of her mother's letters, written before communication with Japan had been severed. Her mother had described festivals back home. The cherry blossom celebrations in spring, the Obon dances in summer, the way entire communities came together to celebrate life and honor tradition. Those memories felt like stories from another lifetime, but perhaps they were invitations to remember who she had been before the war changed everything. But this would be different. American music instead of traditional Japanese melodies, unfamiliar dances, American and German families, who might stare at their foreign faces with curiosity, suspicion, or mere bewilderment. Would they be welcomed as guests or exhibited as curiosities? As the discussion continued late into the night, Akiko realized that the decision itself was significant. For the first time in 18 months, they were being asked to choose something for themselves, to exercise judgment about their own welfare, rather than simply comply with decisions made by others. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested to know which places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. The bus ride to Garmisch-Partenkirchen took them through valleys that told the story of war's end in layers of destruction and tentative recovery. 17 of the Japanese women had volunteered for this unprecedented adventure, each wearing American Red Cross clothing that had been carefully selected to help them blend into civilian settings. Simple dresses in navy blue and forest green, with cardigans to ward off the mountain evening chill. Akiko sat beside the window, watching the landscape roll past like frames from a documentary film. German farmers worked their fields under the supervision of American agricultural advisors, their movements methodical as they cleared debris and prepared soil for replanting. The mountains themselves looked different now, less threatening, as if the end of active warfare had somehow softened even the granite peaks that surrounded the valley. Tank tracks still scarred some hillsides, and the occasional bombed-out building stood as a reminder of what had been. But there were also signs of renewal, new construction, freshly painted houses, children playing in village squares without the fear that had marked the final months of the war. It was as if the entire region was slowly exhaling after holding its breath for too long. "I can hear music already," whispered Sachiko, the former teacher who sat across the narrow aisle. Her face was pressed to the window like a child's, and indeed, the distant sound of brass instruments and accordion melodies was beginning to drift through the evening air as their convoy approached the outskirts of Garmisch-Partenkirchen. Staff Sergeant Nakamura turned from his seat at the front of the bus, his expression mixing professional duty with genuine concern. "Remember, ladies, you are guests tonight. The townspeople have been informed of your attendance, and most are curious rather than hostile. However, please stay close to your escort officers. If you feel uncomfortable at any point, simply find one of us, and we'll arrange for you to return to the bus." The American soldiers who would serve as their escorts looked almost as nervous as the women themselves. These were young men, most barely out of their teens, who had spent months or years thinking of Japanese people as the enemy, and who were now responsible for ensuring the comfort and safety of Japanese women at a German folk festival. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. As they rounded the final curve before entering the town proper, the fairground came into view, and several of the women gasped audibly. The town's main square had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. Colorful banners strung between lampposts, wooden booths arranged in cheerful rows, and strings of electric lights that created a warm glow against the approaching dusk. American soldiers and their families mingled with German civilians in a scene that would have been impossible to imagine just weeks earlier. Children ran between the booths clutching paper cones of roasted almonds, their laughter cutting through the evening air like music. A carousel played waltz melodies while painted horses rose and fell in eternal circles, and the smell of bratwurst, roasted chestnuts, and something sweet that might have been candied apples mixed with the mountain breeze. "It's beautiful," Mariko whispered in Japanese, and Akiko squeezed her friend's hand in agreement. As they stepped off the bus, the reality of their situation hit with full force. They were Japanese women, former prisoners, attending a German folk festival under American escort, in a world where all these nationalities had recently been trying to kill each other. The complexity should have been overwhelming, but instead it felt like a miracle of human adaptability. Their American escorts, young soldiers who seemed as nervous as the women themselves, guided them toward a cluster of picnic tables that had been reserved near the bandstand. Private Tommy Martinez, a baby-faced soldier from Texas who couldn't be older than 19, addressed his question to Mariko with the careful politeness of someone who had been extensively briefed on proper behavior. "Ma'am, would you like some lemonade, or perhaps some of that German beer if you prefer?" Mariko nodded shyly, her limited English supplemented by gestures that conveyed gratitude. "Lemonade, please. Thank you very much." As the evening progressed, the initial tension began to dissolve in small, almost imperceptible increments. A German woman approached their table, her teenage daughter in tow, and offered them homemade pretzels with a smile that needed no translation. The woman's hands shook slightly as she made the offering, and Akiko realized that this act of kindness required courage on both sides. "Danke schön," Yuki replied in her careful German, and the woman's face relaxed into genuine warmth. American wives of stationed soldiers, many of whom had never traveled beyond their home states before the war, struck up conversations through a mixture of gestures, smiles, and the few German phrases they had learned. One young woman, clearly pregnant with her first child, pointed to the carousel and mimed riding it, asking if any of them would like to try. The band that had been setting up during their arrival was a traditional Bavarian folk ensemble. Men in lederhosen and women in dirndls carrying instruments that looked like they had been crafted by master artisans generations ago. Their music was entirely different from anything Akiko had heard. Not the formal classical music that had been popular in Japan, not the American swing that played on the armed forces radio, but something earthy and joyful that seemed to rise from the very soil of this mountain region. When the music began in earnest, the transformation was remarkable. The crowd, which had been mingling politely but cautiously, suddenly came alive with shared rhythm. Couples took to the makeshift dance floor in front of the bandstand, their movements following patterns that seemed to be passed down through generations of mountain folk. The joy was infectious, spreading through the gathered people like ripples on water. Children clapped along to the music while their parents danced. American soldiers attempted to follow the steps they were being taught by German partners, and everywhere there was laughter, genuine and unforced. Captain Rodriguez appeared at their table, his dress uniform neat and his expression warm. "Ladies, I hope you're enjoying the evening. Would any of you care to dance? I promise, no one will think less of you for enjoying yourselves, and the steps are easier than they look." Akiko watched the dancing couples, her mind drifting back to festivals from her childhood in Kyoto. Her father had taken her to temple celebrations, where traditional music played and people moved in slow, formal circles that honored both the gods and the changing seasons. The steps here were different, the music foreign, but the fundamental human impulse to celebrate life through movement and rhythm was exactly the same. The moment that would define the entire evening began with a small act of courage that rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. Mariko, the former Red Cross nurse who had always been the bravest among them, stood up from the picnic table with a determination that surprised even her closest friends. She had been watching the dancers for nearly an hour, her foot tapping unconsciously to the rhythm of the Bavarian folk band, her eyes following the intricate patterns of couples spinning and stepping in perfect synchronization. The music reminded her of something her grandmother had told her years ago, that music was the language people spoke before they learned words, and that dancing was prayer made visible. "I would like to try," she announced in careful English, words she had been practicing during quiet evening hours with their American escorts. Her voice carried the clear pronunciation of someone who had learned the language from textbooks, but her meaning was unmistakable. Private Tommy Martinez looked as surprised as everyone else at the table. The baby-faced soldier from Texas had spent the evening making awkward conversation about the weather and the quality of the German beer, clearly out of his depth in this unprecedented social situation. But when Mariko extended her hand toward him, with the dignity of someone issuing a formal invitation. His face broke into a genuine smile. "Yes, ma'am, I'd be honored," he replied, standing so quickly that he nearly knocked over his chair. The crowd seemed to pause as the Japanese woman and American soldier made their way to the dance floor. Conversations quieted, and several people turned to watch with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Akiko felt her heart racing, not just for her friend, but for what this moment represented. The first time any of them had voluntarily stepped into the larger world as participants rather than observers. The hesitation lasted only a moment before the music swept them up, and other couples resumed their spinning and laughing. Martinez, clearly nervous but determined to be a gentleman, guided Mariko through the basic steps of a traditional Bavarian folk dance. His movements were uncertain at first, but Mariko's natural grace and her experience with formal Japanese dances helped her follow his lead. What happened next was pure magic. As the music continued, their steps became more confident, more synchronized. Mariko's face, which had been marked by careful concentration, slowly relaxed into the first genuine smile Akiko had seen from her friend since their liberation. Martinez, meanwhile, seemed to grow taller with pride and relief as he realized they were actually dancing together successfully. Akiko felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sadness but from a joy so profound it was almost overwhelming. When had any of them last felt happiness that wasn't shadowed by fear, uncertainty, or the constant awareness of their precarious situation? When had they last been simply young women enjoying music and companionship? "Miss Tanaka," she turned to find Sergeant O'Brien standing beside her chair, the same soldier who had first entered their detention center 3 weeks ago to announce their liberation. His usually practical uniform had been replaced with dress blues, his hair neatly combed, and his expression carried a mixture of respect and nervous hope. "I'm not very good at this," he admitted, extending his hand with a bow that reminded her startlingly of the formal courtesies she had learned as a girl in Kyoto. "But my grandmother always said music was the language everyone could speak, regardless of where they came from." As they joined the other dancers, Akiko discovered that the steps were indeed simpler than the traditional dances she had learned as a child, but the rhythm was surprisingly similar to some folk songs from rural Japan. The basic pattern involved couples moving in a large circle, with periodic opportunities for individual partners to spin or step apart and come back together. O'Brien proved to be a better dancer than his modest disclaimer had suggested. He guided her through the steps with patient gentleness, and when she made mistakes, he simply adjusted his own movements to accommodate hers. As he spun her gently around, she caught glimpses of the other women at their table, Yuki laughing as a German grandfather, with a magnificent white mustache, taught her the basic waltz steps, Sachiko clapping along enthusiastically from the sidelines, her face bright with delight. The scene around them was remarkable in its ordinariness. American soldiers danced with their wives, who had followed them to this foreign assignment and were now experiencing their first taste of European culture. German families shared tables with former occupying forces, their children playing together while parents navigated conversations in broken English and elementary German. Local teenagers taught complicated folk dance steps to curious American GIs, while elderly German couples demonstrated techniques that had been passed down through generations. "You know," O'Brien said during a pause between songs, his voice carrying the kind of honesty that comes from unusual circumstances, "I've got a little sister back home in Ohio. She's about your age, maybe a year younger. I keep thinking about how scared she'd be if she found herself in your situation, how grateful I'd be if someone showed her kindness instead of suspicion." Akiko studied his face in the colored light, cast by the string lanterns overhead. His blue eyes held sincerity rather than pity, and she realized that this was perhaps the first conversation she had had in over a year, where she was being seen as an individual person rather than as a representative of an enemy nation. "Your sister is fortunate to have a brother who understands that wars are fought between governments, not between people," she replied carefully in English. "Many soldiers would not make that distinction. Sometimes I wonder if any of us really know what we're fighting for until it's over," he replied thoughtfully. "But nights like this feels right. This feels like what we should have been working toward all along, people from different countries sharing music and food and laughter instead of trying to destroy each other." The band struck up a slower melody, something gentle and sweet that seemed designed specifically for couples to sway together, under the string lights that had transformed the town square into an outdoor ballroom. Around them, the evening was settling into that magical hour when day meets night, and the ordinary world becomes temporarily enchanted. As they danced to the slower rhythm, Akiko found herself thinking about the letters she would write to her family when mail service to Japan resumed. How could she possibly describe this evening? How could she explain that the enemy had become protector, that strangers had become friends, that music and dancing had proven more powerful than any weapon in bridging the chasms that war had created between people? The song ended with a flourish of accordion and violin, and the crowd applauded not just the musicians but themselves, as if they recognized that they had participated in something remarkable. As O'Brien escorted her back to the table, Akiko noticed that several other Japanese women had been invited to dance, and that the initial curiosity of the German townspeople had transformed into genuine warmth. The barriers that had seemed so insurmountable at the beginning of the evening, nationality, language, recent history, had not disappeared entirely, but they had become permeable, allowing human connection to flow through the spaces between difference and similarity. The evening was settling into its final phase when the band announced they would play 3 more songs before the fair officially ended. The musicians, who had been performing for nearly 4 hours, looked tired but satisfied, their faces glowing with the particular exhaustion that comes from bringing joy to others. The crowd, sensing that this magical interlude was drawing to a close, seemed to press closer together, as if trying to capture every remaining moment. Akiko found herself standing with the other Japanese women at the edge of the dance floor, watching American and German families beginning the slow process of gathering their belongings, collecting tired children, and preparing for the journey home. The scene reminded her of festival endings from her childhood, that bittersweet moment when celebration gives way to ordinary life, when the extraordinary briefly becomes memory. It was then that a small figure appeared at the periphery of their group, a little girl no more than 7 years old, with blonde braids tied with blue ribbons and wearing a traditional dirndl that was clearly her best dress. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that she had apparently picked from the field behind the fairground, daisies, cornflowers, and something purple that might have been wild violets. The child approached with the fearless curiosity that only children possess, her eyes wide with interest, rather than the caution that marked most adult interactions between former enemies. She walked directly to Sachiko, perhaps recognizing in the former teacher someone who understood how to communicate with young people. "For Sie," the child said in German, offering the flowers with the solemnity of someone presenting a state gift. "For you." Sachiko knelt down to accept the bouquet, her movement as formal and respectful as if she were receiving an offering at a Shinto shrine. She bowed deeply, a gesture that made the little girl giggle with delight at this exotic foreign courtesy. "Danke schön," Sachiko replied in her careful German, her voice thick with emotion. "They are very beautiful." The child's mother hurried over, clearly embarrassed by her daughter's boldness in approaching the foreign women. "Entschuldigung," the woman began, but Sachiko stood and smiled, shaking her head to indicate that no apology was necessary. "Bitte, keine Sorge," Sachiko replied, using one of the few German phrases she had learned. "Your daughter is very kind." For a moment the two women, one German, one Japanese, both mothers in their hearts if not in current circumstance, stood together watching the child wave enthusiastically at all the Japanese women before skipping back to rejoin her family. The simple interaction carried more diplomatic weight than a dozen international treaties. Captain Rodriguez appeared at their gathering place as the band began dismantling their equipment and vendors started closing their booths. The fair was ending, but he seemed reluctant to break the spell that had settled over the evening. "Ladies, I hope this evening has been pleasant for you," he said through Staff Sergeant Nakamura's translation. "The buses will be ready to take us back to the center shortly, but please don't feel rushed. If you'd like to purchase any small souvenirs or try any of the remaining food, you have a few more minutes." As they waited, several American soldiers approached with small gifts. Nothing elaborate or expensive, just tokens that would help preserve the memory of this impossible evening. Private Martinez presented Mariko with a small pin featuring the American and Bavarian flags crossed together, something he had apparently purchased from one of the souvenir booths. "So you'll remember that Americans and Germans can be friends," he said simply. "And maybe so you'll remember that Americans and Japanese can be friends too." Sergeant O'Brien offered Akiko a program from the band, signed by all the musicians in a mixture of German and English. "So you'll remember the music," he said, "and maybe so you'll remember that there are still good people in the world, even after everything that's happened." Other gifts followed. A small wooden carving of a Bavarian mountain scene, postcards showing the town before the war, even a few wildflowers pressed between pieces of wax paper by German children who had been watching the foreign ladies with fascination. Each offering was small in monetary value, but immense in symbolic weight. The ride back to the detention center was quieter than the journey there, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with reflection rather than anxiety. Through the bus windows, the lights of Garmisch-Partenkirchen grew smaller behind them, but something fundamental had shifted in how these women saw their temporary captors, their current situation, and their prospects for the future. Back in their quarters, they gathered as they always did before sleep, but tonight the conversation was entirely different. Instead of discussing fears about repatriation or uncertainty about what awaited them in Japan, they talked about the music, the dancing, the kindness of strangers who had every reason to treat them with suspicion, but had chosen generosity instead. "I had forgotten," Yuki said quietly, carefully placing her small wooden carving on the nightstand beside her bed, what it felt like to be treated as a human being rather than as a problem to be solved or a threat to be contained. "The music reminded me of my father," added Mariko, pinning her flag pin to her pillow where she could see it. "He used to say that music was proof that different people could create harmony together, even when they couldn't speak the same language." Sachiko sat by the window, holding her bouquet of wildflowers, and looking out at the American camp where soldiers were settling in for the night. "That little girl," she said wonderingly, "she didn't see us as enemies or foreigners. She just saw us as women who might like some flowers." Akiko lay in her narrow bed, holding the signed program and thinking about everything that had transpired. Tomorrow would bring them one day closer to their journey home, to families who might not understand what they had experienced, to a Japan that would be rebuilding just as Germany was rebuilding. There would be challenges, adjustments, and the difficult process of integrating their wartime experiences into peacetime lives. But they would carry with them the memory of this impossible evening, the night when former enemies danced together under Bavarian stars, when music proved stronger than the barriers that war had built between people, when they learned that liberation could mean more than just the absence of captivity. It could mean the restoration of dignity, the recognition of shared humanity, and the simple but profound experience of being welcomed as guests rather than tolerated as burdens. The wildflowers from a German child, the crossed flags from an American soldier, the music program signed by Bavarian musicians, these small tokens would travel with them across the Pacific, physical reminders that even in the darkest periods of human history, individuals could choose kindness over suspicion, celebration over revenge, hope over despair. If this story has captured your attention, please leave a like. It helps the story of these brave women reach more people. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and leave a comment about what this story meant to you. Here, we keep reopening the forgotten chapters of history, one story at a time. Years later, when historians began documenting the small acts of humanity that followed Germany's surrender, most would focus on the grand gestures of rebuilding and reconciliation. But for 17 Japanese women who attended a Bavarian folk fair in the spring of 1945, the most important lesson of the post-war period was learned not in conference rooms or government offices, but on a makeshift dance floor where strangers chose to see each other as people deserving of dignity, respect, and the simple joy of shared celebration. The war had ended with surrender documents and military ceremonies, but peace, real peace, began with music, dancing, and the revolutionary act of former enemies choosing to trust each other enough to share an evening of happiness under the stars.